Hey everybody, welcome back to another one of our YouTube walkthrough PowerPoint lecture videos, PowerPoint slide things. Today we're going to talk about the Allies turn the tide. It's going to be lesson 4, so it's going to be 9.4. And today we're going to go ahead and get started. So here's going to be our learning objectives. Understand how nations committed all of their resources to fighting World War II. Explain how the Allies began to push back the Axis powers in Europe and the Pacific. Describe the Normandy landings and the Allied advance toward Germany. These are going to be your vocab terms, your key terms: internment, Rosie the Riveter, aircraft carriers, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, as I'm going to write them out a lot in these PowerPoints. Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin, Dwight Eisenhower, Stalingrad, D-Day, and the Yalta Conference. So let's get started with the idea of a commitment to total war. As 1942 began, the Allies were in trouble. German bombers flew unrelenting raids over Britain, and the German army advanced deep into the Soviet Union. In the Pacific, the Japanese onslaught seemed unstoppable, but helped by extraordinary efforts on the home front and a series of military victories, the tide was about to turn. So these are going to be the 3 little sub-chapters in this section. It's going to be governments redirect resources. What does that mean? Limits on individual rights, and women help win the war. So those are going to be 3 pretty important things. So the first thing we're going to do is talk about how the governments redirect resources. To achieve maximum war production, the US and Britain increased their economic and political power. They directed economic resources into the war effort, ordering factories to stop making cars or refrigerators and to turn out airplanes or tanks instead. So when we're talking about the United States, a lot of the older manufacturing factories, especially in Detroit and Chicago and the Midwest in general, they're going to have a shift of focus. They're going to be told by the government saying, hey, instead of making 1,500 cars a day, right, like the Ford or Dodge or whoever is making Pontiac, whoever's making cars, instead of, churning out cars, hundreds of them a day, why don't you instead switch on building Jeeps? Right, that's how Jeeps are going to get started. They're going to be built in the factories in Michigan. Instead of making like Sears or Maytag or stuff like that, instead of you guys making refrigerators, why don't you try to make parts for airplanes, and so on and so forth. Right. So a lot of these companies are going to gear and shift towards the war effort. Today we can see this with the whole COVID thing. I know a lot of companies, like clothing companies, clothing brands that I've been aware of, they've shifted their focus from making clothes or like shoes or something to making masks, right? They usually do that for the benefit of the greater good, right? So they raise money by holding war bond drives. By buying bonds, citizens lent their government certain sums of money that would be returned with interest later. So pretty much the government's taking loans out on their people. Right, so usually when you ask for a loan, you go to a bank, and the bank says, "Hey, we'll give you $10,000, but at 20% interest, 15% interest." Right, so you're gonna pay us back with a little bit more. Right, that's exactly what war bonds were, where people would go to the government and they would give them money, and the government would promise to pay them back with a little bit extra. Right. Wartime economic policies placed limits on individual economic freedoms. Governments implemented government programs to ration the amount of certain goods consumers could buy. Rationed items included rubber, tin, gas, and certain food items. In the United States, the war stimulated the economy by creating millions of new jobs. Right, so this is going to be pretty interesting. There's going to be a lot of policies placed that's going to limit the amount of waste you could have. So, for example, if the one that comes out of my mind, the top of my mind, I remember reading a documentary about, was a company that would later become Victoria's Secret. Back in the day, and some of them still do, some bras and some garments would have like wire straps. They would have like actual metal inside of their, to give them their shape. And so what a lot of these companies had to do, because of these economic policies, enforced by the government, they were not allowed to put in the wire, because that wire, instead of going to the bra factory, is now going to the factory that's going to make bullets, and so on and so forth. So people couldn't really get their hands on these raw materials. And, a lot of things were rationed. So for example, like flour was rationed. Instead of selling flour to the public, a lot of the flour was kept for the soldiers. And a lot of it was shipped off to be supplied, for other things and stuff like that. Salt was another one. Chocolate was a big one. A lot of these, coffee was another big one, where they started to give less and less to the civilians. That way, the more and more the increasing military presence, they could get a little bit of that too. Now, this is going to be huge, right? The United States going into World War II is going to get the country out of the Great Depression easily, right? It's going to create millions of new jobs in these factories, right? And the biggest thing is a lot of the men are going to, what we're going to talk about soon, as a lot of the men are going off to the military, who's going to go ahead and replace that labor force, right? Number one, it's going to be a lot of the older men that don't have jobs, right? A lot of the people who are 45 to like 65 who are still able to work but didn't have a place to work. They're going to be able to go in and fit into those jobs that are now, empty. And the second thing is, it's going to be huge for women, right? Women are going to go out, they're going to get out of the house, which is a terrible thing to say. But, this idea of them being able to join the workforce, to get out of the house, to get out of the kitchen, and to step forth into a factory, or, and there's other things we're going to talk about soon. But all of these jobs are going to be created in the factories, in these ammunitions factories, in these tank manufacturing companies, and so on and so forth. It's going to be a huge boost for the economy. Now, if you look here, you're going to be able to see just how much of a boost World War II is going to be for the U.S. economy. The Allies' commitment to an all-out war meant a shift in manufacturing from commercial to military goods and equipment. Producing for the war effort also helped keep Americans employed. Analyze charts. What generalization can you make about GDP and war production based on the data in the chart? So another thing that's really interesting to look at is it's going to be pretty much very correlated, right? And it's going to be no coincidence that the United States is still going to spend trillions of dollars on the military, because it's good for the economy, right? It's a military industrial complex. So for example, if you're here in 1990, right, it makes sense, right? The only one that really doesn't is the Soviet Union. They just spend a lot more than everyone else, right? Like a lot more compared to how much they make, but it's pretty similar. Now, limits on individual rights. Under the pressures of war, even democratic governments limited the rights of citizens. They censored the press and used propaganda to win public support for the war. In the US and Canada, racial prejudice and concerns about security led to internment or confinement during wartime of citizens of Japanese descent. Japanese Americans on the West Coast and Japanese Canadians were forced to move into camps inland where conditions were very poor. Some 40 years later, both the US and Canada provided former internees with reparations or payment for damages. For most, the compensation came too late. Right, class? Camps, they're going to be labor camps. Like they're not good. They're not going to be death camps, right? They're not death camps like how we're seeing Auschwitz or Treblinka or anything like that. But they're going to be very similar to political prisoner camps. They're going to be very similar to concentration camps in terms of it's going to be one ethnic group. In this case, it's going to be the Japanese, right? Now, why is it Japanese? Because, the United States, even today, the United States is very quick to turn on a group of people, right? Very, very quick to turn on a group of people. Just because you're Japanese doesn't mean you're for Pearl Harbor. Does that make any sense? But that's not how people are going to view things. The government's not going to view it that way. So they're going to go ahead fearing for, Japanese influence and Japanese, type of like spy espionage things. They're going to go all around, California and, pretty much most of the United States. And they're going to, arrest people. They're going to take people into custody. They're going to take entire families. And this happened everywhere, right? This happened everywhere. This happened here in the Imperial Valley. So here's a picture of what this looked like. Fears arose that Japanese Americans might be sympathetic to Japan. As a result, Japanese Americans on the West Coast were placed in internment camps, even if they were American citizens. right, class? They didn't care. They didn't care at all. And here's just a perfect example, right, of this happening in the valley, in the Imperial Valley, right? FBI removes 46 Japanese from the valley. Total of 78 jailed here during week of raiding, all sent to undisclosed destination pending further action, right? That's kind of scary. That's very scary. That's very similar to what, the Germans were doing, to, a lot of their political prisoners, to the communists, to stuff like that. There's really good stories, right? There's really good stories written about this time, about living in the internment camps. And it's awful. It's absolutely awful. A lot of them are going to be in central California. A lot of them will be like in the deserts, but there's really nothing there. And they're going to be treated terribly. It's one of those times in American history, right? There's a reason why I'm bringing it up. It's one of those times in American history that is really glossed over. When we talk about World War II, we talk about how we did everything right. This was absolutely wrong. Right? This is one of the few things that we did that is absolutely atrocious, right? So this is just taken from the actual article. Within 36 hours of the bombing of Pearl Harbor, at least 3 ethnic Japanese in the Imperial Valley had been apprehended by the FBI. 2 were from Brawley. And I'm going to go ahead and let you guys read this if you guys want. I just want to let you guys know that it was even here in the valley, right? Now, women helped the war. As men joined the military, millions of women around the world replaced them in the essential war industry jobs. Women symbolized by the character of Rosie the Riveter, which is this, right? Really famous, incredibly famous, probably the most famous American propaganda poster of all time. In the U.S., built ships and planes and produced munitions. British and American women who served in the armed forces had many auxiliary roles, right? They drove the ambulances, they delivered airplanes, they decoded messages, right? A lot of the women were behind the scenes in the military. But in terms for the actual domestic, which means here in the United States, right, the domestic economy, the domestic factory jobs, a lot of it was women. A lot of it was women. And they did a really good job. And that's going forward, that's really going to open the eyes to a lot of American companies to where they're saying, we don't need to hire just men to do these jobs. Right? Women are more than capable enough to do it. Right. And here's another example, right? Another perfect example of a woman going above and beyond what they were expected to do. In this case, here's what's going to happen to the USSR, to the Soviets. Right? In some instances, even women were in the battlefield. Soviet pilot Lydia Lityak participated in 66 missions, successfully shooting down 12 Luftwaffe fighter jets. Right? She shot down 12 German fighter jets. She is the first female to ever shoot down an enemy aircraft, the first woman to ever, right, earn the title of fighter ace, and the first, right, she holds the most records for the most confirmed kills for a woman. Having women in the war front is going to be a lot more common for Russia, just because they're not really going to care, and the fact that they're just going to send just massive amounts of bodies at the problem. They're going to always have the biggest army, just because they don't really care about life. It's really weird to say it like that, but they're not really going to care, honestly. And so it gets to the point where a lot of the women are going to have to step in and fight. And as we're going to see when we talk about Leningrad and Stalingrad, right, it was a lot of the women were the ones that were fighting, right? They were fighting in the streets, fighting in the buildings, guerrilla warfare. And so, Lydia Lityak is going to be, a really famous Russian hero, war hero. And not just a war hero, but a hero for a lot of women, saying that, why can't we do this? Why can't we be fighter jet pilots? And it's going to take a long time before the United States gets their first ever, right, fighter jet pilot. And even then, right, they're not really talked about, right? They're not really a thing. And so it's really good to have this as an influence going forward for a lot of women in the Air Force. Now, class, we're going to start talking about the progress on the 3 fronts. During 1942 and 1943, the Allies won several victories that would turn the tide of battle. They fought on 3 main fronts: in North Africa and in Italy, in the Soviet Union, and in the Pacific. Right, so North Africa and Italy is going to be one thing. So it's going to start in North Africa and eventually spread into Italy. Okay, and then it's going to be the Soviet Union. That's going to be the Eastern Front. And then the Pacific is going to be in the Pacific Ocean. It's going to be Japan, the United States, Hawaii, right, Pearl Harbor, and all that stuff. The Battle of Midway, and so on and so forth. So these are going to be the 5 things that we talk about in this chapter. Right, Japan suffered setbacks. The big 3 strategized. Who are they? victory in North Africa, Allied invasion of Italy, and the turning point in Stalingrad. So Japan suffers setbacks. In the Pacific, the Japanese suffered the first serious setback at the Battle of Coral Sea. The battle lasted for 5 days in May of 1942. For the first time in naval history, ships engaged in battle never even saw each other. All right, that's huge, right? There's going to be two ships who are fighting who aren't close enough to see each other. Now, why? Right? Attacks are carried out by planes launched from aircraft carriers or ships that transport aircraft and would accommodate the takeoff and landing of airplanes. Right? Well, that's why. They're going to be far enough to be able to have ships on, not ships, but they're going to be ships who are going to be far enough to have fighter jets. And they're going to be fighting in the ocean, right? And that's going to kind of count as a Navy victory because it is at sea. Right, this Allied victory was followed by an even more impressive win at the Battle of Midway in June 1942, which is also fought entirely in the air. Right, class? This is where the American air superiority is really going to start. The Luftwaffe is going to be head and shoulders above everybody until the United States really puts an effort into creating very efficient and mobile, right, fighter jets. And even then, the Luftwaffe, a lot of the jets in the Luftwaffe are going to be superior in terms of technology, but we're just going to be able to pump out and produce, right, just way more jets. So yeah, okay, well, your 10 jets are better than mine, right, slightly better than mine, but what if I make 20 jets to your 10 and they're kind of just as good, right? Well, of course, you're going to want to pick the 10, right? So the Americans destroyed 4 Japanese carriers and more than 250 planes. The battle was a devastating blow to the Japanese. After Midway, Japan was unable to launch any more offensive operations. So after the Battle of Midway, the Japan was really cornered, right? A lot of the people in Japan are going to start questioning Hideki Tojo, who's going to be the prime minister, the general, the one that's leading everything. Because at that point, Japan's going to have to be on the back foot. They're going to have to be playing defense the whole time. They're going to do it very well, as we're going to read next time we do our next PowerPoint. They're going to defend the islands extremely well, but it's not going to matter because they're not going to be able to go and attack us like they did Pearl Harbor, right? They're not going to be able to go. We're not going to have to worry about being attacked. We're going to have to be the ones attacking. Okay. Now, these 2 videos are going to be clips about the Battle of Coral Sea and the Midway. They're very, very good. They're very good clips. So go ahead and watch those. Now, the big 3 strategize. After the U.S. entered the war, the Allied leaders met periodically to hammer out a strategy. In 1942, the big 3, which are going to be the 3 main leaders of the Allies. So it's going to be Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR is going to be American. Winston Churchill is going to be English, and Joseph Stalin is going to be the person in charge of the Soviet Union, agreed to focus on finishing the war in Europe before trying to end the war in Asia, right? So they're going to get together and say, hey, what's the most important thing here, right? It's going to be Europe. Now, why are they going to prioritize Europe over the Pacific? Is because the Pacific is mainly just Japan. When in Europe, it's going to be a lot more people, right? Millions of more people that are going to be in the crosshairs, I'm sorry. From the outset, the Allies distrusted one another. Churchill and FDR feared that Stalin wanted to dominate Europe. Stalin believed that the West wanted to destroy communism. None of the new Allies wanted to risk a breakdown in their alliance, however. At a conference in Tehran, Iran, in late 1943, Churchill and FDR yielded to Stalin by agreeing to let the borders outlined in the Nazi-Soviet pact stand against the wishes of Poland's government in exile. So what's going to happen here is that America and the UK are going to be good allies, right? We're going to see this through the Lend-Lease Act, through the Cash Carry Act, and it's going to be something that we're going to continue to this day, right? The United States and England are going to have a very, 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 very good relationship going forward after this. Even before this, World War I, we had a really good relationship, right, class? But Joseph Stalin is pretty much the lesser of 2 evils, right? Who would you rather have, who would you rather fight, Hitler or Stalin? In this case, it's going to be Hitler, right? Because he's doing atrocious things that we know about, right? He's doing terrible things that we know about. Stalin, he's doing terrible things that we don't know about, right? We have no idea what's going on. We don't know anything about the gulags. We don't know anything about their genocides that they're doing in their own people, right? So going forward, we're gonna just have to grit our teeth and say, oh, we really don't want to work with Stalin. We really don't want to work with Russia. But in order for us to defeat Hitler and defeat Germany, we're going to have to team up, right? The enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? So in order for Stalin to trust us as in the United States and Britain, the United States and Britain are going to have to say, hey, the Nazi-Soviet pact that you made initially with Germany, that still stands. So Poland belongs to you, right? Now, the Polish government, who's no longer in charge because right now they're occupied by the Germans, right? But the Polish government who would be in charge are not going to like that, right? They're not going to like that. They're going to want their independence. So they know, Poland knows, Poland's under the assumption that when the war is over, and if Russia, the United States, and England win, that means Poland is still not going to be free. They're going to belong to who now, class? Right? Exactly, the Soviets, right? Because that was part of the pact that they had. So going past that, let's talk about the victory in North Africa. In North Africa, British forces led by General Bernard Montgomery fought General Rommel, right? The Desert Fox. After the first battle of El Alamein in November of 1942, the Allies finally halted the Desert Fox. The British, with the brilliant General Bernard Montgomery, was finally able to finally be the person that's going to stop Rommel. Rommel was going through North Africa and completely demolishing whatever the Allies threw at him. And finally, Bernard Montgomery is going to be the first person to actually give it back to him. He's going to be able to not just outmaneuver him and be able to get draws, but he's actually going to win. Later in 1942, American General Dwight Eisenhower took command of a joint British and American force in Morocco and Algeria. The Allies finally halted the Desert Fox advance. Allied tanks drove the Axis back across Libya to Tunisia. Advancing on Tunisia from the west, the Allies trapped Rommel's army. It would soon surrender in May of 1943. Right? This joint effort between Bernard Montgomery and Dwight Eisenhower are going to be two of the most brilliant, tacticians that America is going to have, especially in land combat, right? Especially in this type of terrain. And it's just going to be too much for Rommel. Rommel is going to be brilliant. Regardless of what side you are in this war, Rommel as a military mind is one of the greatest of all time, right? He's going to be, right, the Alexander, the Napoleon of right, the Nazis. He's going to be the one that's responsible for winning all of these battles. But it's just not going to be enough. Eventually, it's just going to be too much. They're going to have to retreat back into Tunisia, and eventually he's going to get surrounded, and he's going to have to surrender. Right? And this picture here is going to be Dwight Eisenhower. At the time, General Dwight Eisenhower, soon to be President Dwight Eisenhower. Yeah, he becomes president. So this is what it looks like. Right here, the Allies had tremendous challenges to overcome in order to regain control of Western Europe and Africa from the Axis. Analyze maps, blah, 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 blah. Right, so if we look at this map, if we look at North Africa, right, this is North Africa. Most of it's going to be under Axis control. Why? Because Rommel's going to go from, right, he's literally going to go from country to country to country to country, from city to city to city to city, and is just destroying everything. Right? We're not going to be able to do anything. So eventually what we're going to be able to do, class, is through two things, right? Through Morocco, we're going to have Eisenhower. Through El Alamein, we're going to have Montgomery. And eventually, it's going to become a two-pronged attack who are going to be able to drive the forces into one area, right? It's hard if you're in the middle. It's hard playing. Right. Remember, I don't know if you were, as a kid, you played, a monkey in the middle. Right. It's hard being the person in the middle to try to defend two different areas. Right. And that's what there's going to happen here. So they're going to have this massive in-force, right? This massive in-force. And eventually he's going to get stuck in Tunisia, Rommel, the Desert Fox, and he's going to have to flee to Italy, Sicily in general. Right. So one by one, all of these countries are going to fall back under, right, Allied power. They're going to be free of the Axis. And eventually, we're going to have to work our way in through Italy, right? So that's why it's together as one front, right? The African and Italian front, because it becomes one thing. So once again, class, through Morocco and through Algeria. From here, it's going to start in Egypt and through Libya, and then eventually get to Tunisia. Kick them out of Tunisia into Sicily, which is part of Italy, right? And that's how that's going to work. Now, the Allied invasion of Italy. While North Africa under their control, the Allies were able to cross the Mediterranean into Italy. In July of 1943, a combined British and U.S. military landed first in Sicily and then in southern Italy. They defeated the Italian forces there in about a month. After the defeat, the Italians overthrew Mussolini and signed an armistice, but the fighting did not end. So let's go back. Let's go back to here. Right, class? So Sicily is going to be this island right here, right? That's Sicily, right? Southern Italy is going to be here. So initially, they're going to go ahead and go through here. But then after they start, right, just rampaging Sicily, they're going to start being able to land in different areas. If that makes any sense. So it's going to be Sicily initially, and then it's going to be the rest of southern Italy. Right. Eventually, like I've said this multiple times, the Italians on their own aren't very good in terms of their generals, in terms of their military campaigns, in terms of their leadership. Mussolini himself was a very charismatic man. He wasn't the best military leader. He wasn't a Rommel. He wasn't an Eisenhower. He wasn't a Roosevelt. He wasn't a Stalin. He wasn't someone who was able to actually navigate the battlefield himself. And what I mean by navigate the battlefield himself is, I mean, to be able to put people in power to do it himself, right? Hitler's going to be able to do that, right? He's going to give the power to Rommel. Say, hey, Rommel, you got to do this. Hey, Goebbels, you got to do that. Right? We're going to say, hey, right? FDR is going to say, hey, Eisenhower, do what you got to do. Hey, right, General Patton, do what you got to do. And so on and so forth, right? They're not really going to do that. And of course, like how they usually happen with Italy, they're going to meet resistance. They're not going to do very well. And they're going to rely on Hitler once again and the Nazis to help them out. Hitler's going to send in German troops to rescue Mussolini and reinforce the Italians fighting in the north. For the next 18 months, the Allies fought slowly up the Italian peninsula, suffering heavy losses against a strong German resistance. Still, the Italian invasion was a decisive event for the Allies because it distracted Hitler by forcing him to fight on another front. So this is huge, right, class? Because Hitler's armies are going to be in France, right, in the French on the west, right? Also in the east, in the Soviets, right, they're going to be trying to capture Leningrad and Stalingrad and all that, right, in Moscow. They're going to be fighting in Russia. So you already get your army, split it in half, and throw it like that, right? One here, one here. Now you have a third one. Now you have to fight in the south. You have to fight in Italy. So now you have three fronts that you have to worry about. Before you didn't have to worry about that at all. Now you do. So that's going to stretch the rest of the fronts thin because you have to take men from both sides and put them here. If that makes any sense. So that's going to be huge, right? So the Allies aren't going to be necessarily upset that it's taking forever. Actually, they're going to work slowly on purpose because they know that the more troops that Hitler sends into Italy, that's going to be less troops everywhere else. And that's ultimately going to be a good thing. And if those of you who've watched, right, many movies, there's a Quentin Tarantino movie called Inglourious Basterds that is, I think it's rated R. So I'm not telling you to watch it, but if you have watched it, it's taking part during this time of the war. So they're in Italy, right, under German occupation. So it's about this time period of the war. It's a really good movie. Turning point in Stalingrad. So now we're going to talk about the Eastern Bloc, right, the eastern part of the front. A major turning point occurred in the USSR. After their lightning advance in 1941, the Germans were stalled outside Moscow and Leningrad. In 1942, Hitler launched a new offensive. This time he aimed for the rich oil fields of the south. His troops, however, got only as far as Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad was one of the costliest of the war. Hitler was determined to capture Stalin's namesake city, and Stalin was equally determined to defend it. The battle began once the Germans surrounded the city. As winter closed in, a street-by-street, house-by-house struggle raged. In November, the Soviets encircled their attackers, trapped without food or ammunition and with no hope of rescue. The German commander finally surrendered in January of 1943. So that's 2 months, right? December, January. After the Battle of Stalingrad, the Red Army took the offensive and drove the invaders out of the USSR entirely. The Hitler's forces suffered irreplaceable losses in both troops and equipment. By early 1944, the Soviet troops were advancing into Eastern Europe. So what's going to happen here in Stalingrad is Stalingrad is a major city. Stalingrad is a very major modern city. It's a newer city. Hitler is a sucker for symbolism, right? He loves the idea of symbolism, right? He's going to go ahead and give speeches at the palaces of former kings, right? The former king of Belgium, right? In his palace, he's going to give a Nazi rally speech there. He's going to make the France sign their surrender armistice, right? Their treaty to give up in World War II, in the same boxcar that the Germans had to sign the Treaty of Versailles. And he loves stuff like this. So him and his commanders are just absolutely just giddy at the idea of having the USS have to lose Stalingrad, right? The city named after their great leader Stalin, right? That's all he's obsessed with this idea. However, class, the Russians are obsessed with keeping Stalingrad protected, right? So they're going to go ahead and it's going to be a complete, total, all-out war. The idea of total war is going to be not started here, but it's no better example of here. People living in the city are going to take arms and they're going to be the military, right? No, you cannot no longer rely on the military to protect you. You're protecting yourself, right? So for example, if me and you, right, let's say, I don't know, there's an apartment building and people in the apartment building, we see the Germans coming. Well, what do you think we're going to do? Wait for the military to do something about it and just let them walk in it? No, absolutely not. The people there are going to fight them themselves, right? That's the idea of total war. And it's going to be a massive, absolute massive bloodbath. Stalingrad is pretty much going to be like 99% destroyed. Entire city blocks are going to be reduced down to rubble. But the Russians aren't going to care, right? The Russians, especially when winter comes, they're going to have the endurance, they're going to have the mindset, and they're going to have the absolute will and determination to keep fighting. And eventually they're going to be able to, just through sheer force of will and sheer strength and just the human condition to survive, they're going to really just be able to fight back until they're pretty much all dead. And eventually there's going to be a few thousand people left in the city and they're going to win. They're going to be able to starve out the German commander and they're going to surrender. Once they do that, they're going to go ahead, Germany's going to go ahead and get a lot more troops. And from there, that's going to be the turning point. It's going to take almost the brink of death in Stalingrad and the country to rally around that, right? Remember Stalingrad. Remember the effort. Remember the sacrifice that your brethren and your comrades made in Stalingrad. And we got to take it back to them, right? This battle of Stalingrad, right? This city getting destroyed is going to give and fuel the Russians, the Soviets, this absolute hatred, right? We hate Nazis. Americans hate Nazis. We really do. But no one's going to hate Nazis as much as the Russians because they destroyed their cities, right? They destroyed their villages. They destroyed, right, a lot of cultural landmarks, a lot of statues that were there for thousands of years, right? Gone in a blink of an eye. And the Russians are never going to forgive them. So the Russians, when they're fighting, they're going to fight with this extra hunger that really is going to be unprecedented. That we're just not going to be able to, we're not going to see that again. And so they're going to go back on the offensive. So they're going to be able to drive the Germans, the Nazis out of Russia, and they're going to be just on a roll. They're going to not get slowed down. They're going to go into, right, Poland. They're going to, Nazi-occupied Poland, and they're going to be able to pretty much like that go all the way to the border of Germany and completely decimate every Nazi that they see. It's going to be really, 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 really eye-opening, just the amount of fury that they're going to have towards the Nazis. Now, progress on the three fronts. Aircraft carriers, right? This is a perfect example of the aircraft carrier. I know we've all seen one before. But they're going to be huge. They're going to be absolutely huge. Yeah, actually, like in size. I'm talking about like in massive size. They're absolutely huge. So if you could look here, like that's the size of a person. Like he's just a little dot on the thing. It's absolutely massive. The second front in Europe. So now we're going to talk about the Western Front. By 1944, the Western Allies were at last ready to open a second front in Europe by invading France. General Dwight Eisenhower was made the supreme Allied commander. Now, he's going to be the one, after his incredible display in North Africa and Italy, he's going to get promoted to be the guy that's in charge of the entire, all of it. You're just in charge of Europe. Whatever's fighting in Europe, you're the person that's going to lead the charge. You're going to be the person who's going to strategize everything, right? He's going to be the supreme Allied commander. He and other Allied leaders faced the enormous task of planning the operation and assembling troops and supplies. Right, so these are going to be the four main parts of the Western Front. The Normandy landings, the liberation of France, advancing towards Germany, and the Yalta Conference. Now, the Normandy landings. The Allies chose June 6, 1944, known as D-Day, for the invasion of France, right, the beginning of the liberation of France. Just before midnight on June 5th, Allied planes dropped paratroopers behind enemy lines. Right, class paratroopers are troopers that are with parachutes, where they go in planes and then they jump out and then they hide. They wait, and then they sneak attack. Then at dawn, thousands of ships ferried 156,000 Allied troops across the English Channel. The troops fought their way through underwater mines and raking machine gun fire, and the casualties mounted as they reached the shore. Right, another incredible video here. If you guys want to watch that, please do. Now, that's going to eventually lead to the liberation of France. Despite heavy losses, the Allied troops clawed their way inland from the beaches of Normandy. In early August, a massive armored division under American General George Patton helped the joint British and American forces break through German defenses and advance towards Paris. Meanwhile, other Allied forces sailed from Italy to land in southern France. In Paris, French resistance forces rose up against the occupying Germans. Under pressure from all sides, the Germans retreated. On August 25th, the Allies entered Paris. Within a month, all of France is free. Right, class? This is going to be huge. This is going to be huge. Because now that they don't have to worry about France, Germany is going to have to retreat inside of its own country. Right? It went from this massive empire, and eventually it's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and it's back to its own country. And under that context, they're going to be completely surrounded. Right? From the west with the US and British, the east by the Russians, and then the south, right, by the US and British, right, through Italy. Now, advancing towards Germany. After fleeing France, Allied forces battled towards Germany. As the Allies advanced into Belgium in December 1944, Germany launched a massive counterattack. At the bloody Battle of the Bulge, which lasted more than a month, both sides took terrible losses. The Germans drove the Allies back in several places, but were unable to break through. The battle delayed the Allied advance from the west, but only for 6 weeks. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last major offensive attack. Right, class? So as Germany was retreating back into its country, they're going to go ahead and try to have a counterattack. And it's going to work, right, for the Germans, right? It's going to give them some time to kind of regroup and figure out what they're doing. But at the end of the day, with tons of people dying on both sides, it's not going to be enough to really break American and British forces. And it's only going to postpone the inevitable. Right, for 6 weeks. The Battle of the Bulge is going to be Germany's last major, right, offensive attack. So this is what it's going to look like. So as you can tell here, from Leningrad, Moscow, Stalingrad, it's going to be Stalingrad. The Russians are going to completely just decimate whatever Nazi occupation is in their way. Right, they're going to win the Battle of Kursk, Warsaw, and Poland. And eventually from here and from Leningrad, they're going to easily march into Berlin, but not yet, right? We're not going to talk about that yet, right? From here, from Moscow, they're going to reach Warsaw. From the rest of the Soviet Union, they're going to go in, and they're going to concentrate on Germany. However, the southern side is they're going to try to clean up Eastern Europe. They're going to try to clean up the south, right? So here's going to be the British and American forces. In here, they're going to be from Tunisia. They're going to go into Sicily. They're going to capture Palermo. They're going to go into Salerno, Anzio, Rome. Once they capture Rome, that's where they get Mussolini, right? They're going to go ahead and they're going to finally all meet here at the Battle of the Bulge, right? D-Day is going to happen here in Normandy. It's going to be a massive attack, right? A massive joint effort from the United Kingdom. They're going to, sail, I think it's like 14, 15 miles from the UK to France, when they're going to meet heavy resistance. But eventually, they're going to lose. They're going to recapture France, and then from there, they're going to go into and really see the last line of defense here, which is going to be the Battle of the Bulge. And it's really going to be most of that all here. So it's going to be Russians fighting from the bottom, American soldiers fighting from the American and British fighting from the south, and then right from the southwest here, they're going to go around Switzerland, the Swiss Alps, and this is really going to catch them off guard, right? Because they're going around, and then eventually it's just going to be too much for Germans. This time, Germany was really under the clock, right? This time Germany was really under around-the-clock bombing. For 2 years, Allied bombers hammered military bases, factories, railroads, oil depots, and cities. The goal of the bombing was to cripple Germany's industries and destroy the morale of its civilians. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound like Blitzkrieg? Because it's exactly what we did to them, right? What they did to London, what they did to Frankfurt, what they did to Paris, right? What they did to Spain, what they did to whoever they wanted, to Russia, right? The United States is going to go ahead and do this to them right back at them at greater capacity, right? By 1945, Germany could no longer defend itself in the air. The Luftwaffe was gone, destroyed. And in a 110-day period, bombing almost erased the huge industrial city of Hamburg, killing 40,000 civilians and forcing 1 million to flee their homes. In February of 1945, Allied raids on Dresden killed as many as 135,000 people. The attack on Dresden later started controversy because Dresden was not an industrial center and was seen as one of Europe's most beautiful cities. Right, class? So this one here, this is supposed to be a video of the attack of Dresden. So guys, go ahead and click that, watch that. It's pretty good. The bombings are in America, because we're not the ones getting bombed, right? We're very sympathetic. We're like, oh no, like we don't want to see that happening, right? All these innocent people are dying, and it's terrible, right? But London and Britain and Germany, right, they're not going to be the ones that are feeling bad for them, because it happened to them, right? London got destroyed, right? It got raided, right? It was firebombed, right? Leningrad, 95% of it was burnt to the ground. Stalingrad, 95% of it was burnt to the ground. Moscow was heavily bombed, right? So they had no ill will, right? Germany deserved it in the eyes of the British, in the eyes of the Russians and the French, right? And so the United States is going to go ahead and be complicit, and the United States are going to go ahead and just bomb them, right? They're going to, and it's not going to look good in American eyes back home, but it's going to be viewed as, revenge. The only one that's really going to be viewed as like kind of unnecessary is how much we bombed Dresden. Because Dresden really had nothing to do with the war. It was just a city, right? It was as if, right? It was a symbolic thing, right? That's what we bombed it for. It was more symbolism. The second front in Europe, right? And this is going to be just an example of the B-52 bombers that we used, and it would just massacre everything. Absolutely massive air fortress. Now, the Yalta Conference. At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin planned for the final stages of the war and post-war Europe. The meeting took place in an atmosphere of distrust. Stalin insisted that the USSR needed to maintain control of Eastern Europe to be able to protect itself from future aggression. Churchill and Roosevelt favored self-determination for Eastern Europe, which would give people the right to choose their own forms of government. Stalin agreed to hold free elections in the newly liberated nations of Eastern Europe. However, he soon showed he had no intentions of upholding that promise. The three leaders also outlined a plan for post-war Germany. It would be temporarily divided into 4 zones to be governed by the American, French, British, and Soviet forces. Although the war in Europe was almost over, the Allies was less certain on the outcome of the Pacific. So here at the Yalta Conference, it's going to be one of the last conferences they have as allies. And it's going to be very, very, very interesting, to say the least, because a lot of the times Churchill and Roosevelt are going to look at Stalin with just the massive amounts of distrust, and rightfully so. Stalin is going to say, hey, well, we need to control Eastern Europe, right? We need to control Eastern Europe. We need to be in control. That way, there's a buffer zone. So if Germany ever gets, the third empire, right? Let's say World War III happens, and Germany is somehow, again, the bad guys, right? We want a buffer zone. We don't want them to be able just to go directly into our country again. We want to be able to have a buffer zone. That's their excuse for wanting. The U.S. and British are going to say, hey, well, why don't you just let the people decide what they want to do? And he's going to eventually say, yeah, you're right. And of course, he's not going to mean any of it. Now, what about the Pacific, right? Roosevelt and Churchill were eager to get the Russians to declare war on Japan. Stalin agreed that the USSR would enter the war against Germany within 3 months of Germany's surrender. In return, Churchill and Roosevelt promised Stalin that the Soviets would take possession of southern Sakhalin Island and the Kuril Islands. Those are the 2 islands that Japan took from them the last time they had a war, the Russo-Japanese War. And an occupation zone in Korea, right? And I'll give you guys a hint. The Korean War comes from this, right? And that's pretty much it. Here's going to be a picture of the second front, what it looked like. And here's going to be your guys' questions. Go ahead and answer those. And that's it, class. If you guys have any questions, please email me. Talk to you guys soon. Bye-bye.